So I'm about a month into having received my late stage ADHD diagnosis. I was diagnosed recently with autism and ADHD, and I just wanted to come back and speak to you about what that has meant for me so far. So getting a late stage diagnosis can come as a shock for some people, but for me, I always knew that I felt different to most people that I found myself around. Now, I always considered that there might be lots of different reasons for this. For example, I had a quite tumultuous upbringing and childhood, and this meant that I was always looking at my life experiences through a trauma lens or trauma informed lens. However, as I have aged and grown, I noticed that as my life improved and things were said normal and I was successful and I was happy and I was in a happy, committed relationship and all of these things seemed to be working out for themselves, I still could not shake this feeling of something being not quite right in the way that I found myself moving through the world. I also noted that when you have children, and I have two small ones under 5, that, I noticed some traits in my children that I found to be quite interesting. And that led me to think about my own upbringing and my own childhood and how I was often referred to as being overly sensitive, which when you're in a situation that is perhaps quite abusive, or as I say, there was all types of things going on within my home, from neglect to physical abuse to sexual abuse to all different types of things. So being called sensitive in those circumstances just never felt right. It felt like, no, there is something wrong here. And I'm really just highlighting the fact that it is wrong. But anyway, we won't go into that right now. Um, but just so that you have a bit of an understanding of why, that sense and that feeling of difference was not necessarily associated with neurodivergence from my perspective. Now, that all changed as I got into my profession, which is a helping profession, one of the allied health professions. And we look at, disability inclusion, supporting people with varying different needs across varying different sectors and environments. So neurodivergence just became something, I suppose, like many of us in more recent times, that I became more aware of, that I had more of an understanding of, in a way that I never had before. So I was home educated. So this wasn't something that would have ever necessarily been picked up in my childhood by another professional, because I just wasn't in mainstream school for long enough for that to occur. But perhaps it may never have happened because, as we know, women are often underdiagnosed or misdiagnosed, and Black women, that increases even more so. So that intersectional experience may have meant that my challenges, if I had had any, would not have been seen. I'm also considered, I suppose, what you might say is high functioning or high achieving, high masking. So again, because of the lack of understanding and knowledge around autism and neurodivergence in general and what that should look like. There are people who have very high support needs. There are people who are nonverbal. There are people, for unfortunately, due to stigma and due to a lack of understanding and ignorance, quite frankly, people do not understand what autism looks like, and that is why it is a spectrum, because it looks different for everyone. But it is still very much, and can be for some people, even those who are considered to be high masking or high functioning or even twice exceptional, it can be quite debilitating in its own ways. So as I've kind of carried myself through this month, perhaps a month, maybe just a little bit over a month for my ADHD diagnosis, but for my autism and ADHD diagnosis, or the learning that I in fact have both autism and ADHD, it has been about a month. But anyway, it has been awakening and eye-opening in so many ways that I didn't expect it to be. I know myself quite well, or I've always felt that I had quite a lot of self awareness and understanding of myself. But seeing it myself through this new lens is definitely changing maybe some perspectives that I had about myself, um, that I initially thought was kind of shyness or um, or trauma. So understanding, for one, that there are so many people out there in the world who navigate the world in a similar way that I do. Obviously, we're all individuals, we're all unique, and no one is the same. No one has your brain or the same brain as anyone, but there are similarities and I suppose even generalizations that you can make about neurodivergent individuals. And I have learned that through doing a little bit of research into the autism diagnosis and the ADHD diagnosis, but also how those kind of exist together. So this idea of ADHD, which isn't an official diagnosis within the DSM-5, but which is often how it is termed when people are given a diagnosis of both. Now, I know I've used the word diagnosis quite a lot, and that it's, of course, because I have a clinical background, but I do understand that autism and ADHD are more than a diagnosis. It's more than uh, disability, a condition, an illness, however people may opt a deficit. It's more than that. It's who you are as an individual, to you are as a person. It's no different to the fact that I'm a Black woman. It's no different to the fact that I am 5'8". It's no different to the fact that I'm a mother. It's just who I am. It's part of my identity, and that may have many strengths as well as many challenges that come with that. And that is going to vary depending on who you're talking to and depending on each individual. So I've been doing quite a lot of research into what this means for me. So again, when I say research, I mean I am looking at the lived experiences of other people, of people who have this diagnoses, and I am looking at people who represent me who have this diagnosis. I'm looking at literature and what it says about people who have these diagnoses. And I am watching programs about people who have these diagnoses. I'm following more voices on social media of neurodivergent individuals who are absolutely changing the game and just breaking down the barriers as well as stereotypes to what this actually means for people. As I say, the spectrum is so broad, it's so wide, and there is no one way to be neurodivergent. And I think I am learning that every single day, and it is coming with peace. It's giving me some peace because I'm realizing, okay, I'm maybe comparing myself to other people who I know who are neurodivergent, and maybe comparing myself to their needs versus my needs, or their high needs versus my low needs, or when it comes to things such as workplace adjustments and or reasonable adjustments for completing your job and your tasks, or even just adjusting for yourself individually for your home, giving yourself grace, not living with shame and guilt over the things that maybe you aren't managing as well as you'd like to be managing. I feel like, through comparison to others, especially those who have higher support needs, you can tend to almost minimize your own autistic experience, your own ADHD experience, because you feel that you maybe don't fit the mold of what society or the media has portrayed neurodivergent individuals as. But the more I've researched and kind of gone down this rabbit hole and found all of these different voices, I've realized that actually there are a lot of people who are neurodivergent who are very similar to me, who are, working in fields such as academia and clinical fields and STEM and all of these different things. And actually, that is some of our strength. To be working in those fields due to a number of different traits and things. But again, I don't want to go into generalizing people. But yes, it's just been validating to understand myself, but also see that those people who are maybe also considered to be high masking or high achieving or twice exceptional are still experiencing the world, still experiencing their personal challenges, and still advocating for themselves and advocating for the support that they need, which is something that I have feared doing, specifically within my professional space. And that is due to a number of things. Perhaps it's a lack of psychological safety, some of the conversations around workplace adjustments, reasonable adjustments, and how my perception of how those conversations have maybe been or how I have perceived them to be, as well as knowing, the discourse in within social media, and again, this idea coming not only from places like Facebook or LinkedIn, but in terms of actual professional academics, experts in the field, politicians, whoever you want to bring into this, the idea that there is an over diagnosis or an epidemic of people being given a diagnosis of ADHD and autism. And so that also can make you feel very much like you don't want to disclose something because you know that many people unfortunately have this view or this idea that these diagnoses are being driven by, capitalism, and that somehow this has become kind of a pyramid scheme of money making. That's how so many people view this boom, if you will, in diagnosis, and specifically late stage diagnosis, because they feel that if this was a challenge that you have had since you were a child, which often the diagnostic criteria expects you to have had, that it would have been picked up. So often it's being framed that it's something else, but perhaps that it's a social anxiety. Of course, we've not long come out of a pandemic and things of that nature. But again, I think that some of those arguments remove the contextual nuance that can exist within each individual person. For example, myself, who was a home educated person who did not go to school after the age of around 8 years old, um, who was a Black woman, Black girl, who would have been a Black girl, who maybe this wouldn't have been picked up in because all of the research was done. Previous research had only been really conducted looking at young white males. So again, there's so many reasons to why so many people, and women especially, have not been diagnosed. And again, that's because women were under research, women and girls were under researched. The understanding was not there. The change from attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, so from ADD to ADHD, meant that people were not being picked up because that hyperactivity was not being seen, perhaps in the way that people had been used to looking for it or describing it or explaining it. But what was really interesting for me was, how my psychologist explained to me that hyperactivity um, can look different across the spectrum, and often hyperactivity of the mind and of the brain, and the brain that never switches off, doesn't stop running, is also how that hyperactivity can show up. And that, of course, there are different types of ADHD, and of course levels of autism, which I still need to do a lot more research into. But again, back to the point of reasonable adjustments, I was highly advised that I should seek that specifically within my workplace. And I've yet to do that. In fact, I've yet to disclose because I'm waiting for a moment to see whether that is something that I want to do. I did an almost informal disclosure to one colleague, my mentor. But again, I think even that very brief experience made me kind of stop in my tracks and question whether this was a route that I wanted to go down. And I don't know if that is kind of internalized ableism or what it is. But again, being an intersectional person, I feel that adding another barrier to myself or to how I am perceived because of people's ignorance rather than what is the reality of my capability and who I am as a person, isn't necessarily something that I have yet been ready to do. So I do think, intersectional experiences can really challenge how you kind of perceive this diagnosis and how you feel about seeking support and things like that. because as I say, I have neurodivergent individuals around me who are quite open and almost proud, really. When I say almost proud, they are very proud and very open and very advocating for themselves and people within their community. But I do think that there is a lack of evidence around Black neurodivergent individuals, and there's a lack of representation of Black neurodivergent individuals. However, I have managed to find some. So that's been really wonderful to see, because I just think representation is important in all realms of society in all different avenues. And so for me, it has been helpful to see how it might manifest and how people who look like me may mask compared to white neurodivergent individuals. I actually came across this post on LinkedIn where the term code switching was used to describe autistic masking. And I found it highly problematic because code switching, of course, is very much culturally relevant to Black individuals and Black people across the diaspora who have to change and switch themselves in order to survive historic and contemporary and modern day racial violence, oppression, and marginalization. So again, some neurodivergent spaces are probably not going to be for me just because they are filled with individuals who do not look like me, do not understand my perspective, and do not understand where our experiences may differ. That intersectionality, they may not understand that. And I feel that, as I say, to refer to autistic masking as code switching is highly problematic, and it's just more appropriation of terminology and struggle and challenge that Black individuals face, and it's unnecessary because again, masking, the terminology already exists. And whilst I believe that there could be more research and literature around this, again, that research needs to incorporate lived experiences of all individuals from all different backgrounds, because actually it's going to look quite different depending on who you are as a person and your characteristic traits. But yes, as a Black woman dealing with both code switching and masking and understanding that that has been going on for me for essentially my whole life is quite eye opening, but also affirming. And I have been quite emotional over this past month. I don't think I've cried quite as much as I've cried this month, and I don't know why that is. I don't want to say that I am in mourning of anything. I think I'm just more aware of myself and possibly hyper aware of my differences and how I navigate the world and where I've navigated the world and I've done well for myself, and I tend to, be well received and get on with people and things like that. I also really value being alone and isolating myself, and friendships have always been quite difficult. Um, and at the same time, I've always been the sought after friend, but I'm just very sensitive and I prefer my own time. And I also have high moral standards and views, and justice is very important to me in regards to humanity and how people are being treated in the world, and how, the experience of this world is different for so many of us. And that matters to me and it's important to me. So sometimes I do struggle in kind of more neurotypical settings, or even um, spaces where I just feel out of place and different because the things that maybe matter to me or the conversations that I might want to have are completely different and so far removed from the conversations that I um, engage in on a daily basis when I'm trying to kind of make polite small talk with peers and colleagues and anybody. So friends, it's really difficult. So yeah, I am still navigating these diagnoses, and I am learning so much about myself and about others who are, have lived experience of being neurodivergent, and I'm realizing that maybe it was never about being an isolated person who doesn't like anyone or who doesn't want to be around people. I'm very much a people person, and at one point perhaps I thought I was even a social butterfly, or that's how people perceive me to be anyway. But again, socializing does exhaust me, mentally, physically, emotionally, everything. And I find it more and more difficult. And I think since becoming a mother, I just don't have the energy or the time to mask and code switch and all of these different things that I have been doing in order to fit myself into this very narrow box of what is considered the norm or what is considered appropriate. But yes, that's just a little bit of where I'm at with it right now. And I would love for you to comment and let me know if you have been diagnosed with autism or ADHD or both, and if you were diagnosed as a child and what that meant for you to get that diagnosis early versus if you've been diagnosed, misdiagnosed even, or diagnosed late stage in life, and how you've handled that. There's not very much support that comes after the diagnosis. However, I was really pleasantly surprised to have received a call from my GP yesterday, stating that I was going to have a telephone appointment with my GP to discuss my recent assessments and diagnosis. So I'm not sure what that's going to entail. I have a little bit of anxiety around that because, the reports are so in depth and so personal, but I am keeping an open mind, and I'm hopeful that it will be something that is beneficial um, to me and offers some support or some kind of idea of how to navigate uh, life post diagnosis, because I'm definitely finding, as I say, that I've been so emotional and I have found myself just really questioning all interactions and also unsure of how to disclose. I have been trying to disclose. I've even taken some risks and disclosed to people who I'm kind of rekindling friendships with. So maybe don't feel the safest space, but that felt like a part of my journey and healing journey as well. So it felt like a necessary thing to do, um, going back into this friendship that I've recently kind of rekindled. But yeah, this is kind of me just processing it all. As I say, the past month, 6 weeks, it's been a bit of a whirlwind. Kind of get the diagnosis, you have it, and then it's kind of like, okay, what do I do now? But as I say, I was highly advised to seek that support. So I'm just basically considering whether I should do that. And I'd love to know your personal experiences and whether you did seek workplace adjustments or whether you felt you needed them, don't feel that you need them, definitely need them, and maybe what kind of adjustments you did try, you did request. That would be really helpful. But anyway, thank you for stopping by. Stay regal in real life. Bye.